All right. Hello, fellow Planeswalkers, it's Scott, and today we're going to look at the first official day of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. So before we get started, special thanks to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring our video, and remember to like and subscribe to get further Wilds of Eldraine preview content throughout preview season. So we got a lot of cards to talk about, and so let's jump right into it. So first thing I want to talk about are the kind of the mechanics of the set and kind of where they fit in. And we're going to look at some white cards to help us understand that. So first we've got Break the Spell for 1 white mana. It's an instant and you get to destroy target enchantment. If a permanent you control or a token you control was destroyed this way, draw a card. And that works really well with cards like Cursed Courier. For 2 and a white mana, you get a Human Noble. That's a 3/3 with lifelink. But when Cursed Courier comes into play, it creates a Cursed Roll token and attaches to him. And that means that while the Cursed Roll token is on Cursed Courier, it's a 1/1. So one of the things I think we'll see a lot of is Break the Spell, because this is going to be a way of getting rid of these roll enchantments that are going to be very common throughout the set. And the fact that if you do it to your own, you can draw a card, I think that's a pretty good benefit to a lot of people. And I think we'll see Break the Spell potentially as a card that's just included in decks as, hey, I don't need this anymore. Let me get some card draw here. Next, we've got the list of what each of the rolls does. So first, we've got Cursed. Enchanted creature has base power and toughness of 1/1. Okay, so that's the negative one. Monster roll. Enchanted creature gets +1 and has trample. Royal roll. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has ward 1. Sorcerer roll. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has, whenever this creature attacks, you get to scry 1. Wicked roll. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and when this aura is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. And then we have the Young Hero roll, where enchanted creature has, whenever this creature attacks, if its toughness is 3 or less, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. And I think that's probably the best of all the rolls. So we'll have to see how these are going to be put onto different cards, but it has a lot of potential in the set. Next, we've got Besoft Knight for 3 and a white mana. You get a Human Knight. That's a 3/3 with an adventure. So the adventure mechanic is returning, and Betroth the Beast, you get to create a Royal Roll token attached to target creature you control. So this is, we're seeing adventures come back, so that'll be a good, and I'm sure we're going to have some good adventure cards throughout the set. Next, we've got Gallant Pie Wielder for 2 and 1 white mana. You get a Dwarf Knight. That's a 2/3 with First Strike, and it has Celebration when Gallant Pie Wielder has double strike as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn. So I think that is certainly something that we're going to see some ability to play throughout the course of Wilds of Eldraine season, because there's a lot of cards that come into play, create a token, like a blood token. So I think activating that ability is not going to be very hard, but is that a build around? And I probably don't think at this point we've seen enough cards to make a decision on that. Next, we've got some of our rare and mythic cards. So starting with some rares, we've got 3 Blind Mice. So sagas are returning in the set. You've got 2 and a white mana. You get a saga that on chapter 1 creates a 1/1 white mouse creature token. On chapters 2 and 3, you get to copy a token. You create a token that's a copy of target token you control. And on chapter 4, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. This reminds me a lot of Wedding Announcement. We see a lot of play of Wedding Announcement in white decks. So I think 3 Blind Mice has the ability to probably see some play too. Next, we have Expel the Interlopers for 3 and 2 white mana. You get a sorcery that you get to choose a number between 0 and 10 and destroy all creatures with power greater than or equal to the chosen numbers. I'm really interested in this card because this might be really good in an aggro deck, because aggro decks usually don't have the ability to deal with your opponent's larger creatures that mid-range decks present. But with Expel the Interlopers, you can put probably, say 3 or 4. It doesn't affect any of your creatures, but it wipes out a lot of theirs. So I think this is a card that we'll see some aggro players experimenting with as a potential board wipe that is one-sided. Next, we've got Lich Knight's Conquest for 4 and a black mana. You get a sorcery, and you can sacrifice any number of artifacts, enchantments, and or tokens, and return that many creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So I think in a graveyard deck, this is a very good card, especially if you're going to be able to create tokens along the way that you can later sacrifice and not just spend 5 mana to get 1 creature back, but spend 5 mana to get 3 or 4 creatures back. And then fill up the board with stuff that you want to have in play, like Atraxa, which is the #1 reanimation target. Next, we've got Decadent Dragon for 2 and 2 red mana. You get a dragon that has flying and trample. It's a 4/4, and when Decadent Dragon attacks, create a treasure token. So very much like Goldspan Dragon without the haste, and it costs 1 mana less. Next part of this is it's an adventure, but notice that it's in a different color. We have Expensive Taste for 2 and a black mana. You get an instant where you can exile 2 cards off the top of target opponent's library face down. You may look at and play those cards for as long as they remain in exile. So you get to exile the top 2 cards of your opponent's decks for 3 mana, and then you can play them later on in the game. So it's kind of like you're drawing 2 cards for 3 mana. Now, notice that you don't get to just use mana as you will to cast it. It's really reliant on the dragon getting treasure tokens to actually be able to cast those spells. So that's one downside of it. So we'll have to see how this mechanically works to see if it's very viable as a standard mechanic. Next, we have our first witch from the set, Hilda of the Ice Crown for 2, a white and a blue mana. You get a legendary creature that's a human warlock. She's 3/4, and she comes with a unique ability. Whenever you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, you may pay 1. When you do, you get to choose 1. Create a 4/4 white and blue elemental creature token, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, or scry 2, then draw a card. So this is an interesting ability, but as we're going to see with a few other cards from the set, it's got a lot of hoops that you've got to jump to really get the advantage of the ability. So we'll have to see if there's a way within the set that you're going to be able to tap things down that would then allow Hilda of the Ice Crown to be a very effective card. But right now, I don't see her as standard playable. Next, we have Baluna Grand Squall for a green, a blue, and a red mana. You get a legendary creature that's a giant noble. She has trample, and permanent spells you cast that have an adventure cost 1 less to cast, and she's a 4/4. So I can see an adventure deck forming around Baluna, because she's going to reduce the cost of those adventures and make them very playable in any kind of deck. Now, the limitation is you've got green, blue, and red mana as a requirement, so that's going to limit you a little bit on what you can play, but I think there's some potential to form a deck around the card. Now, she also has an instant, Seek Thrills, for 2, a green, blue, and red mana. You get to mill 7 cards, and then put all cards that have an adventure from among the milled cards into your hand. So it's a high cost ability, but if you can afford it, then you could potentially get 2 or 3 or 4 cards that you get to put in your hand that you can later cast off of that instant ability. Next, we've got Fawn's Bane Troll for 2, a black and a green mana. You get a troll that's a 4/4, and when Fawn's Bane Troll enters the battlefield, create a monster roll token attached to it. So that means it's really a 5/5 for 4 mana. Okay, good stats. For 1, you can sacrifice an aura attached to Fawn's Bane Troll, and you know there's going to be one. And Fawn's Bane's Troll fights target creature you don't control. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. And you can activate this only as a sorcery. So I think it's a good card. I think it's probably one of the more playable cards we've seen so far. of those that were previewed today. Next, we have Sir Ginger, the Meal Ender. For 2 mana, you get a legendary artifact creature that's a food knight, and Sir Ginger is a 3/1. Now, Sir Ginger and the Meal Ender has trample, hexproof, and haste as long as an opponent controls a Planeswalker. So kind of a unique requirement to get those special abilities, but we do have a lot of Planeswalker C in play in Standard right now. And whenever another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Sir Ginger and scry 1. So I think this is a card that fits very well into the Rakdos Sacrifice deck around Oni called Anvil. So I think this is a card that has a lot of potential in that deck, because basically you play it on turn 2 or 3 and you're just growing it every turn because your Oni called Anvils are going to be sacrificing things all the time, and the result of that is that you're going to be able to get your Sir Ginger to have a very high power and toughness. And she also has the ability to, for 2 mana, you can sacrifice Sir Ginger and you can gain life equal to Sir Ginger's power. Next, we've got the Goose Mother. For X and a green and a blue mana, you get a legendary creature that's a Bird Hydra. It's a 2/2, and it has flying. And then the Goose Mother enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. And when Goose Mother enters the battlefield, create half X food tokens, rounded up. So if you have 5 mana to spend, you put 3 extra mana into it beyond the 2 required, and you get 2 food tokens. You put 5 in, you get 3. You put 7 in, you get 4, etc. And then when the Goose Mother attacks, you may sacrifice a food, and then you get to draw a card. So you're going to have a way of creating... So I think this is going in a food deck, probably is the best place for this. And we know food as a mechanic is going to be a big part of the set, so we'll have to see what else we get and see if that's a viable strategy in Standard. Next, we've got Restless Cottage. It's a land, and Restless Cottage enters the battlefield tapped, but it's going to produce, it's a dual land for us, and it'll produce black or green mana, and it's also a creature land. So for 2, a black and a green mana, Restless Cottage becomes a 4/4 black and green horror creature until the end of turn, and it's still a land. When Restless Cottage attacks, create a food token and exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. So I like the abilities that are attached to these. The other one we've seen has a similar ability when it attacks. So I think what we're going to see is all of these will probably cost 4 mana to activate, and then there will be, when you attack, you're going to get a benefit like this of creating a food. Next, we've got Arete of the Charmed Apple. For 1, a white and a black mana, you get a legendary creature that's a human warlock and is a 2/4. Each creature that's enchanted by an aura you control cannot attack you or planeswalkers you control. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses X life, and you gain X life for X's number of auras you control. So in an auras deck, where you're going to put auras on some of their stuff or some of your stuff, I think this has potential to be an interesting strategy. Right now, I don't know if there's enough, though, in Standard to support it. So we'll have to kind of see where this goes, but it's an interesting construct, just like Hilda was, but again, there's a lot of hoops to get through to get there. And let's now talk about Agatha of the Vile Cauldron, and we kind of have the same thing with Agatha. She's costs a red and a green mana, and you get a legendary creature that's a human warlock. It's a 1/1, and then activated abilities of creatures you control cost X less to activate, where X is Agatha of the Vile Cauldron's power. This effect cannot reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1. So you're still going to have to pay 1 for things, but potentially you can get a number of activated abilities down to 1. And we do have a lot of activated abilities on cards throughout what is in Standard today, and obviously in Modern and Pioneer we've got lots of abilities too. So Agatha for herself has her own activated ability that really costs 5 mana, not the 6 that we're showing. So it's 4 and a red and a green mana, and really it's 3 and a red and a green mana. And other creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample and haste until end of turn. So it's an interesting ability. I like the card, but again, it's just kind of where does it fit in, and how are you going to raise Agatha's power and toughness enough to make it really matter in Standard. And our next card then is Kellen the Fey-Blooded. For 2 and a red mana, you get a human fairy with double strike, and as a 2/2. Other creatures you control get +1 for each aura and equipment attached to Kellen the Fey-Blooded. I think this is a very interesting card and one of the more interesting cards from the set so far. And I think where Kellen probably fits in is the Hammer Time deck in Modern and in Pioneer, and also then potentially the for Mirrodin deck that's built around Nahiri in Standard. Because you can attach things to it and it buffs your entire team. And then again, you've got the ability to, again, send those things away. They come back with Nahiri's enchantment that allows that to happen. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that can happen with the card, and I think it fits in those decks. It also has an adventure, Birthright Boon, for 1 and a white mana. You can search your library for an aura or equipment card. You can reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And our next card is then Beseech the Mirror. For 1 and 3 black mana, you get a sorcery with Bargain, and you get to search your library for a card. You can exile it, you exile it face down, and then shuffle. If the spell was bargained, you may cast the exile card without paying its mana cost if that spell's mana value is 4 or less. Put the exile card into your hand if it wasn't cast this way. So again, we've got a lot of things that create tokens in Standard. And definitely Black's got some of those cards as well that we can then use to bargain for a card. And the card that immediately jumps out at me is you have several Beseech the Mirror in your deck, and you're using this to make sure that you get Sheoldred the Apocalypse. So as long as you can bargain, then you're going to get Sheoldred on this turn that you Beseech the Mirror. So I think that in and of itself makes it very playable in Standard. All right, next we've got Virtue of Knowledge. For 4 and a blue mana, you get an enchantment, and if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So there's other cards already in Standard like Elish Norn by other machines that do a similar thing. Certainly having an enchantment makes it a little bit harder to get rid of, but we are going to have more enchantment removal in this set. So I'm not sure if this really has a home in Standard. It also has an adventure, Vantress Vision. For 1 and a blue mana, you can copy a target activated or trigger ability you control, and you may choose a new target for the copy. Next, we've got Rowan and Will Kenrith. So Rowan, Scion of War, is 1 a black and a red mana for a legendary creature that's a human wizard. Rowan's a 4/2 with Menace. Okay, you can also tap Rowan for spells you cast this turn that are black and or red to cost X less to cast this turn, where X is the amount of life you've lost this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. So I think that's a limiting thing about this card. Rowan's card is you have to lose life on that turn. So unless you're using instance and source or instance that you can cast on your opponent's turn, and you can tap Rowan to do that, I think that's maybe when you can get access to this and use it. But for the most part, I think on your turn, it's not going to be a very powerful ability. We do have the Pain Lands in Standard, so I can see you losing some life along the way on a turn. But are you going to want to go ahead and tap Rowan to go ahead and reduce the cost by a couple of mana? And the answer is probably not. So I think Rowan, while it's an interesting card, probably not playable in Standard. Next, we've got Will, Scion of Peace. For 1 a white and a blue mana, you get a legendary creature that's a human wizard with Vigilance, and Will is a 2/4. So Rowan and Will kind of mirror each other. And Will, like Rowan, has the ability to tap, and spells you cast this turn that are white and or blue cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. So again, we have that same problem. Hey, you've got to be gaining life to really activate Will's ability. Will on his own is kind of a okay creature, but not great. Same thing with Rowan. And as a result of that, I don't think either of them is going to see a lot of play in Standard, at least based on what we have right now. Next, we've got Stroke of Midnight for 2 and a white mana. You get an instant that destroys target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a 1/1 white human creature token. So I think this is definitely standard playable, and the reason for that is it does things at instant speed, and it's not limiting to creatures that have, you know, like we do with Destroy Evil, where they've got to have 4 toughness or greater. This is just anything. So I think that in and of itself will help us out, because now you can get planeswalkers, you can get enchantments, you can get artifacts with it. And I think the downside of giving the opponent a 1/1 white human creature token probably isn't that bad for you. And again, the fact that you can cast it on your opponent's turn really helps out the card's value. Next, we've got Glass Casket, which is a reprint from Throne of Eldraine. For 1 and a white mana, you get an artifact, and when Glass Casket enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or less until Glass Casket leaves the battlefield. Now, obviously, we've talked a lot about enchantments in today's video, and the fact that we're going to see a lot of them. And we already know there's going to be a 1 mana, hey, destroy an enchantment. Okay, the upside of Glass Casket is it's an artifact, and there's limited artifact removal right now in Standard, and a lot of it doesn't see a significant amount of play. So given that, I think Glass Casket, you know, potentially will be a valuable removal card for white decks. And our last card of the day is Frolicking Familiar. For 2 and a blue mana, you get an Otter Wizard. He's 2/2. He has flying, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, Frolicking Familiar gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So it's a pseudo Proudest ability that Frolicking Familiar has. I think that's a good ability on this card that can potentially have it come into a standard deck and have playability, you know, and is it spells deck that potentially would use the prowess cards in red along with blue to really grow your creatures each turn, and then a card like Frolicking Familiar really helps out in that situation because it has flying, so it makes it evasive, and that's going to help you out in finishing games off. Okay, it also is an adventure card, so you get Blow Off Steam for 1 red mana, and Blow Off Steam deals 1 damage to any target. So it's another opportunity. If you've got 1 Frolicking Familiar on the field, you play a Blow Off Steam, it gets a +1/+1 trigger, plus the damage you've already done. So I think that combination, you know, I think it makes it an interesting card and has some potential standard playability. All right, that's it for today's video. We went through a lot of good cards today, and I think, you know, even there were other cards that I didn't look at today because they probably really don't have a whole lot of standard playability at this point. Definitely limited playability, and we'll try to take a look at them, or some of them, in another video. So thanks for watching our video. Thanks to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring our video, and remember to like and subscribe this video to get further Wilds of Eldraine spoiler content throughout the rest of spoiler season. Thanks. I'll see you next time.